Questions we need to be faced with. Bill?
Thanks, Dan. Spending many hours on transatlantic or trans-Siberian flights gives you some good thinking time. You aren't interrupted by much other than the stewardess who's encouraging you to play the video games, not read your books that you brought along. But, you know, basically since I first met you folks in 2010, I've evolved considerably. And I basically have thrown away most of my childhood training about morality and what our country stands for and a few other things, and I've had to rethink where we are. And I guess it's kind of fair to say now that I've concluded it's us versus them. The government isn't what I was told it was. Maybe I just didn't realize when I was 10 years old what the government was, and they were able to conceal what they were. But I think some evolution of the government has occurred, and it's not been good. And of course, the internet now allows us to reveal these things, but it allows them to watch over us very carefully. In the last 2 times I've gone to Russia, I've taken National Security Agency coffee mugs and given out. And kind of the reaction this time is, oh, that's the big ears place. Yeah, at least. So, in thinking about tonight, I referred to the Philip Glass movie, or series of movies, and you know he's a modern composer. And in 1982, he produced a trilogy, but one of them was Kwasi, which interprets as life out of balance in the Navajo, or the Hopi language. And I think that's where we are. We have a lot of problems that have to be solved. And some people are intent on creating more problems and not solving the ones we have to solve. And I think we ought to have a big picture view of what's going on and demand that we get people in our governments, both as civil servants and as elected officials, who are capable of dealing with these problems and not creating any more until we solve the existing problems. Dan mentioned the perhaps 3 big areas that I've lumped things into. We have social problems, we have economic problems, and I would say we have almost complete government failure. We have a corrupt government run by a bunch of psychotic lunatics. And I don't think that's very far from the truth. And as you've heard me before, the Russians have an expression, you know, who is to be blamed and what is to be done. Well, I think it's pretty clear where to lay the blame. But it's the second thing that's more difficult, you know. What is to be done? And historically, you know, you can look, civilizations have collapsed. I mean, perhaps a clean little simple example is the Easter Island. They built their statues and vanished. Okay, the Egyptian civilization vanished, etc., etc. Okay, and to some extent, the French civilization vanished, but the Bastille Day. Maybe that's the cure to all our problems, is to have another Bastille Day. Well, under sociology, I'll just give you some ideas, and, you know, think about these. You know, I'm better at finding problems than solving them frequently. Okay? We have a refugee crisis, okay, right now. And in my travels of the last 4 weeks, I've met Europeans, including Russians. Part of Russia's in Europe. And a variety of these Europeans said to me, we really are grateful for the Marshall Plan and saving us from the Nazis. Our gratitude for that. But what in the hell are you doing now? He said, you guys have 320 million people in a 6 billion people world. And he says, you wander around the world, starting wars here, there, and everywhere. Libya, Syria, Vietnam, Iraq. And then he says, where do the refugees go? How many have you taken into the United States? And I could say from these situations, probably near zero. And he says, yeah, they're all coming to Europe. They're coming across in boats to Greece, to Italy, to Sicily, etc. And what are we supposed to do with them? Find jobs, housings, etc., for all of them. And this is a large strain on our economy, our educational system, etc. He says, please stop starting wars around the world. Okay? Beside that, the Russians or the Soviets were always building communism worldwide, and they went bankrupt because of this, simply put. We ended our moon program because of the cost of the Vietnam War. So wars are expensive. Well, then Dan mentioned LGBT. Yeah. I mean, why are we spending so much time on this? Okay? It just shouldn't be a problem. We have wealth disparity. Okay? I mean, people who are having problems with housing or food or whatever, for whatever reason possible, they're not very happy. Okay? And this is why you have revolutions. Okay? Perhaps we could choose Cuba as an example of this a long time ago. They were being exploited, Castro took over, and things went from bad to worse. We have coastal flooding. Okay, Bangladesh is going underwater. Islands in the Pacific are going underwater. You're losing food, places where we can grow food, etc., etc. Okay? We have inner city education. Why can't Johnny read? Because he has rotten teachers? Because the school board steals most of the money? Because there's not a stable family to make him do his homework at night? Etc. But you just can't say, well, it's their fault. No, they end up in prisons that we have to pay for. Okay? It's much better to teach a kid to read and write and get a job than it is to put them in prison and give contracts to Aramark for maggot-laden food to feed to them. Okay? We have the police problem. Okay? When I had left 5 weeks ago, the police had killed 700 people in America so far this year. That was more than 2 a day. Okay? That's not a good situation. And then, of course, some policemen get killed from time to time. We have the unemployment problem because all the jobs have been shipped to China and to Mexico. And as Tim told me tonight, I guess Donald Trump has recognized the Ford family for their contributions to American employment. And then Carly Fiorina, what did she do? She sent all the Hewlett Packard jobs to China. Okay, so how can people pay taxes if they don't have jobs? Okay, and then they lie about the numbers. Okay, then we get trash phone calls all the time. Half the calls that I get on my cell or home phone are garbage, and I'm on a no-call list. What does it mean? We have a no-call list, but it's not enforced. I go to Bell AT&T phone store about 5 times now. Oh, they give you an 800 number where they put you on hold for 60 minutes. Then they give you another 800 number. We'll call you back, but they never do. And then I go back to the AT&T store and I said, I want something done. And the lady says, if you shout at me again, I'm going to call the cops and have you arrested. Oh my God, so I better get my lawyer to send him a letter, okay? And then we have professional sports, where exorbitant salaries are paid. Ice hockey arenas are built with money from the state school funds, etc., etc. But Johnny still can't read, okay? And why are we putting all this educational professional sports where the pro football players end up with head injuries and brain damage and die at an early age? Okay. We have, you know, a variety of things, okay, that have to be addressed just under social things. And then perhaps my last shot here is, I go to Russia, and almost everybody speaks 2 other languages. If you go to Poland, you have to have 3 languages to graduate from high school. If you go to the Netherlands, you have to speak 5 languages. Okay? Boy, how many people in America can speak a foreign language? And I don't give any credit for Spanish. Okay? What school can you go to and learn Russian, Serbo-Croatian, you know, etc., etc.? Very few. Why doesn't the MEA get behind a language program for our students in our schools? Okay. I mean, probably in Dearborn you can study Arabic or some other Middle Eastern language. Chinese on the, you know, over along Lake St. Clair, there's a school over there where Norm Hughes lives that teaches Chinese. So there's lots of social problems that we can look at. And these need to be addressed because they're having a corrosive effect on our society. Then under economic, I just put a few notes, okay? The debt is enormous, okay? You know, it's not a billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you have real money. It's a trillion here and a trillion there, and pretty soon you have real money, okay? I don't know, what is it, $20 trillion in national debt now, something like that. But you start to look at the cost of these wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, hey, a couple trillion. Our debt with China, a couple trillion. All right, well, I guess as long as we can keep printing the petrodollar, someone can burn it in their wood stove. Okay. We have the service economy. What does that mean? Little, okay? Very little, because it really hasn't worked. And you basically need an economy where you're going to make something that the world wants to buy, and it's of high quality, and you can sell it. Like we used to do, where people had, well, one of my favorite examples of something that hasn't failed yet is Michigan Ladder, okay, up on the other side of Michigan Ave. These people have been in business for a long time. They make a quality product. They ship it all over the United States. We need lots of places like Michigan Ladder, okay? You look at the extraction of natural resources to continue to support the manufacturing no matter where it is. And now extraction means on a huge, huge scale. A 12-yard front end loader or a steam shovel, quote unquote, that removes enormous amounts of material at each bite. You know, these things are starting to do damage locally. And if you don't believe that, go look at Mountaintop Renewal in West Virginia. Okay, and the effect of the acid mine drainage, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Which gets us into a little bit of government here. Everybody hates EPA, but industry kind of led to the formation of EPA. But we had EPA, they were going to take care of some contaminated groundwater at a Colorado gold mine. Well, they punched a hole at the wrong place and the water went down the river, et cetera, et cetera. But if the mining company hadn't left the mess, EPA would have had to come in and clean it up. Okay? So some of the things we're doing economically have a large effect. Then we have the judicial lawyer complex. And in engineering, there's something called entropy. which is basically energy you throw away to snatch a little bit of it for useful things. And how much longer are we going to let these parasites, lawyers, assume this very, very important position in our society? I mean, they argue over trivia, they charge exorbitant rates, and I would favorably compare cockroaches to lawyers. And then, you know, talking about industry behavior, well, I guess everybody in Michigan knows this week that General Motors made some faulty ignition switches. And they made them for well over a decade. And there were more than one people, there was more than one person at General Motors who knew about this. But who stepped forward and said, hey, you know, we just killed another person this week because of our faulty ignition switch. Well, someone should have done the right thing, and they didn't. So now General Motors has to cough up part of the TARP money and give it back to the federal government. And how would you like to consider the following effect? General Motors announced a couple weeks ago, before I left, that they were going to start importing Chinese-made Buicks and sell them in America. Now this sounds a little bit like the Yugo, but how would you like to be in a head-on collision in a Chinese-made Buick? Huh? It would give you all the protection of a beer can, right? So think about that.
It might be safer than a car with a faulty ignition switch.
Well, lots of opportunities, aren't there? All right. Now, then my third category here, the government. What can you think of recently that the government has done correctly? Okay. I mean, when you talk about screw-ups, I mean, it's almost every day. You know, for a while I was keeping a list. What has the government done today? And then it just got out of hand. Okay? All right. Well, I just put a few down here. Keep the trains on the tracks. Remember the thing in Philadelphia, and then we have one north of New York City. They go around the curve too fast, and the cars come off the tracks. I found out that this was my Lionel train when I was 6 years old. Okay. We have leaking pipelines who dump petroleum in rivers, in the ocean, etc., because they've corroded. Yeah, steel does this when it's buried in the ground. Okay. We have the bomb trains, which the good Republican rep from Plymouth doesn't want people in Michigan to know about. He wants to forbid you from knowing what time on what tracks we have these 100-car trains from the North Dakota petroleum fields going to the Marathon refinery downriver. Okay. Then we always have legislation that regulates the control of sale of handguns. Oh, we always need, after every disaster, we always have to pass some more gun regulations. But the guy down south, what'd he do? He bought his gun on the weekend when the FBI office was closed and the dealer couldn't call the 800 number and find out if this guy had any psychiatric problems. So this passed more rules and we won't enforce them. Okay. Then, okay, why doesn't the government take care of the veterans? They send them off to war, they get their leg blown off, or they get their arm blown off. And according to my wife, who's been a VA physician now for almost 40 years, if she only had an adequate budget, they could do a lot better job of treating the patients who come in. There's not enough staff. The Ann Arbor VA has done a pretty good job and has escaped detention. Okay. And how about the forest fires in the West? The West is burning. And I would say because of climate change, but I'll get in some arguments about that. But 30 years ago, we demonstrated for the Forest Service this huge Russian airplane called the Ilyushin-76, which will drop about 30,000 gallons of water. That's a tank car on a fire. But the Forest Service, they don't want to put the fires out too quickly because the porta potty, the sandwich guy, the sleeping bag guy, they don't get their contracts. And then they don't support the local politician by giving him a kickback. So having the fires burn and burn and burn It creates jobs for unemployed ski instructors and school teachers during the summer. And then they can go back to work in the fall and forget about the forest fires. Now, a government thing that's really big on the horizon for me, when I talked to you about this a little bit 6 months ago, and this was one of the reasons I went to Russia. Russia every 5 years has a huge meeting of all their explosion scientists, and it was held in Novosibirsk. And just to give you an idea about Russia, Novosibirsk is halfway across Siberia. It's a 4-hour plane ride from Moscow. So it's another 4 hours to the Pacific coast. Okay? It's 12 hours time difference, and if I look a little squirrely this evening, I'm still on Siberian time. Okay, so it's about time to get up in the morning. Okay. Well, I gave the opening paper to Congress, and it concerned 9/11. After reading a great deal more, after I gave my presentation here, along with about 5,000 other American scientists and engineers, we thoroughly believe that 9/11 was a controlled demolition. And after I gave my paper in Russia, almost everybody who came up to me said, yeah, we could have told you that 10 years ago. Okay. And I have a book here that I would strongly recommend to all of you. It's Solving 9/11. It was published in 2013. It's the best presentation I've seen. Okay. And as I said, back in February or whenever I talked to you, we talked about Building 7, which is the building that collapsed at 5:30 in the afternoon. It was not struck by an airplane, had no significant fires. It fell totally symmetrically straight down. Okay. It stinks to high heaven. NIST modeling of it is totally inadequate. Then if you start looking at World Trade Center Towers 1 and 2, and you can read it in this book, you can clearly see the demolition charges going off. And you all remember the snowstorm of dust that went down the street canyons in New York City. This is pulverized concrete. And you only pulverize concrete from very high pressures, as would be produced by high explosives. So I think sometime in the near future, and I don't know how long near future means, it will be obvious to many, many people that this was an inside job. And to put it in the vernacular, Osama bin Laden turns out to be the Lee Harvey Oswald of this catastrophe. So false flag exercises are not uncommon. The Russians reminded me of a couple of theirs that were performed by the FSB, Beslan School, the high explosives in the apartment building, and the hostage situation in the theater in Moscow. So how would our nation deal with the revelation that 9/11 was an inside job? In a parliamentary government, I guess you could say it would bring the government down. But I think probably it would do more than that. Also, you should ask all the candidates who are running for president what they think about the 28-page section of the 9/11 report that's missing and has never been published. It is available for Congress people for reading in a private room as long as they keep it secret. Supposedly it implicates Saudi Arabia. So I think every presidential candidate ought to read this and tell you what they think about it. Okay. With regard to Russia, I'll say a few words about two things over there. MH17, which was the aircraft that was shot down over a year ago now. The Russians have been denied access to the wreckage. But I spoke to some experts in the aviation industry. I spoke to the manufacturer of the missile that perhaps shot it down, Almaz Altay, the Buk missile. And they stated that if the missile approached the aircraft in the trailing mode, as if it were shot by Kiev-friendly people, it would have struck one side of the aircraft. As the missile approached the aircraft in the head-on mode, it would have struck the other side of the aircraft, and presumably it would have been fired by the rebels in the eastern Ukraine. So the Russian people who built that missile can tell from which direction it came, either from the east or from the west. They also mentioned on that missile that every component has a serial number, including warhead fragments. And they know where every missile that they produce goes. And if they're given access to the wreckage, they can tell from the fragments whether the missile was shipped to Kiev or whether it was shipped to the eastern Ukraine. The Russians also said that from the photographs that they've tried to look at, that it looks to them like the fuselage was hit by gunfire, and the gunfire would have come from a Sukhoi 25, which is a ground attack A-10 equivalent. And also the Sukhoi carries missiles. And they said it looked like the gunfire holes in the fuselage were in the vicinity of the cockpit. And the training of a Russian Warsaw Pact pilot is to fire the gun into the cockpit to kill the pilot. So the Russians would very much like access to the wreckage, but so far the Obama administration has decided that this is a bad idea. Regarding the situation in Ukraine, I would suggest that you go to the Wikipedia article on the Kievan Rus. Russia is a very old country compared to ours. It goes back really to 500, 1,000. Christianity was adopted by the Russians in 900 in Kiev. And Central Europe and the Slavs have been basically one nation, although they're fragmented into many small nations, for example, such as Romania, Bulgaria, etc., etc. But they're all Slavs. Many of them, okay, are Orthodox. Some of them in the West are Catholic. But they've been fighting each other for 1,500 years. Okay. When it started out, they were dumping molten lead out of the castle tower. But now they're using 120 millimeter tank guns, which are extremely destructive. And one individual said to me, he says, you know, it's just like America. It's a family fight. He says, in America, you have situations where there's a family fight, the neighbor calls the cops kick down the front door and shoot everybody, including the dog. Okay. And I was impressed as to how much about America and American news the Russians know. Far more than we know about them, because they have access, basically, through the internet to almost anything in the United States. Okay? We get, in my estimation, pure, unadulterated Joseph Goebbels propaganda. And if you don't believe that, just turn on the 6:30 news at night. Okay? It's hard to find out the truth. Okay? Also, I was there when this happened. Gorbachev was promised by Bush 1 that NATO would not expand beyond the German Democratic Republic to the east. We expanded to the Baltics, to Poland, etc. And now we're trying to expand NATO into the Ukraine. And this is just like when Khrushchev decided it was a good idea to put missiles in Cuba. Well, we didn't take to that very kindly. Okay? In 1963, we probably came as close to World War III we've ever been. In my estimation, the Russians are our colleagues. We defeated the Nazis together with the Russians. I took a 3-day vacation in the middle. I went to the Golden Ring, Vladimir, Suzdal, and Rostov. The churches. I mean, in Suzdal, I've never seen so many churches. Okay, a small town. And there's these Russian Orthodox churches everywhere. And people are going to church. They're rebuilding the churches that Stalin destroyed. Okay, etc. So they're Christian people. Okay, and they worship the same God as we do. So when you hear something about the Russians are doing this or the Russians are doing that, I would take it with a big grain of salt. And also I learned that both the son of Biden, who was thrown out of the Navy for drug use, and the stepson of Kerry are part of the U.S. delegation in Kiev that are basically looting the country. A friend of mine, who is the drug rep for Becton Dickinson, a pharmaceutical company out of Baltimore, told me that when she tries to ship shipments of drugs to Kiev, how many bribes she has to pay to various corrupt officials in the Kiev government. Okay, it makes Washington look honest. Well, I would like to close maybe with two things that are going on right now in Washington County in my life. About a year ago, I caught a hunter on my land, called DNR and said, hey, this guy's hunting. DNR says, well, why don't you go down and take down the tree stand? When I told the hunter to get out, he says, you will pay for this. So 3 days later, I had 2 DNR conservation officers come to my front door, threatened to beat me up and throw me in the back of the truck and throw me in jail. So I called my rep, Gretchen, from Celine, and she told me that if I was going to make a federal case out of this, she wouldn't help. So I went to Joe Hune, the senator. He says, how can I help you? And we're forcing DNR to do an internal investigation on this.